captive by Nebuchadnezzar. This was the first of three waves of exportations of the Jews from Jerusalem, 605 BC. And so Daniel and his three friends among them, and this was a common practice of empire leaders when they captured a city or a smaller empire, they would take captives back to their homeland. And Nebuchadnezzar particularly chose captives that he had a plan for. And that plan was to get them back in Babylon, examine them, train them, raise them up, and give them actually court-appointed positions. And so you have to imagine things are changing drastically for Daniel and his three friends and all the rest. I mean, they are taken captive from Jerusalem, walked 700 miles to get back to Babylon. And I can imagine during that journey of all those miles and all those days, it probably took them about a month to do that walking. During that journey, they had to be discouraged, frustrated, fearful, whatever you want to call it. They get back to Babylon, and all of a sudden, everything changes. And so Daniel and his friends were among the group of young Jewish people. And here in verse 4, Daniel chapter 1, verse 4, youths, the word youths, the Hebrew word, typically referred to a young man, somewhere between the ages of 15 and 20, so a teenager. So here's Daniel and his buddies, and they may have been 16, 17 years old. And they get back and are told that this is what's going to happen. The plan is laid out before them. And then last week we looked at verse 4, and these were the qualifications for anybody that was to attain this position in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. Youths, they had to be young, in whom was no defect, couldn't be any blemish or any spot. They were good looking, so they had to be handsome in appearance, showing intelligence. They had to have a great aptitude for learning. In other words, they had to be good students, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding. Understanding, yada, the Hebrew word means knowing, to know mentally. In other words, they had to be able to analyze. They had to be able to be given a problem and work through the problem, logically work through the problem. So a gift of analysis, understanding, discerning knowledge. That's a systematic knowledge. They had to be able to understand science and scientific principles. In other words, they pretty much had to be scholars before they could even be taught. They had the ability for serving in the king's court, and that word serving in Hebrew literally means standing. To stand in the king's court meant you were an official of the court. So these young Jewish teenagers were about to be trained up and given very high positions in the king's court. Had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them, the him there, that's Ashpenaz, the chief of the eunuchs. He ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The literature, of course, is the writing, which would have included Babylonian theology. So they had to become schooled in pagan theology, in literature and writing, or language rather, Aramaic. They had to learn Aramaic language, which apparently Daniel did so well that he wrote, like I said last week, nearly half the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Over half is written in Hebrew, but nearly half is written in Aramaic. And then we come to verse 5, and this is an interesting thing that happens in verse 5. It says, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank. So the process of preparing these young men to serve in the court included dietary requirements. Now, the phrase that's translated there, a daily ration for the king's choice food. The word choice refers to a dainty or a delicacy. Think of the best food. So these young guys were just being told, listen, you are going to be eating the same thing that the king eats every day. So all of a sudden, no more burgers and fries. All of a sudden, it is caviar, lobster tail every day, filet mignon, porterhouse steak, whatever the best cuts were. And I'm thinking, you're a teenager, and you're just told what you're going to be eating every day, and all of a sudden you're thinking, whoa, this is living large. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. You're being trained for a high position in the government. You're being given the best food in the kingdom. You're eating the same thing that the king eats before it is placed before him every single day. It says, and appointed, this is in verse 5, appointed that they should be educated 3 years. 3 years of education. That is more than a college degree. And we think, well, wait a minute, college degree is 4 years. How are they going to do that in 3 years? This is what cramming is all about. I was when I was in the Navy, I think many of you know it, I went to nuclear power school and then nuclear power prototype. That program, the educational part of the program, was 1 year long. 1 year. 1 year was 12 months, not a 9-month school year, it was 12 months. And so in that 1 year, every one of us in the school received the equivalence of an associate's degree in physical engineering or physics, nuclear physics, in 1 year. How'd they do that? We didn't go to school a couple hours a day. We went to school 5 days a week and studied the other 2 days a week, 8 hours a day minimum. And so in 1 year, with no breaks in between, that's an awful lot of hours. That's what these guys were doing. For 3 years, they would be studying day and night language, theology, sciences, the occult, pagan theology, everything. It would have been a tremendously challenging educational process. And so it says they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. That was upon graduation. These guys were going to give them positions in the government that they could not even have imagined when they were taken captive from Jerusalem. So all in all, everything's looking up for these guys. Life's about to be easy. Well, it'd be hard in the sense of this educational process would have been challenging. It would have stretched them, but they were skilled enough in understanding and learning. These were good students. They would have been able to do this. And so when it was all said and done, they would have been given these very high positions. And so every one of them should have been high-fiving each other. Whoa, we finally arrived. This life doesn't get any better. Well, kind of. Look at verse 6. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these teenagers were all descendants of Judah. They came from the tribe of Judah. And as I said last week, it's most likely, most Bible scholars think, most likely Daniel was a direct descendant of King David. He would have been, in verse 3, referred to those who were in the royal line, which was likely Daniel. And then Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah would have been, it also referred to the nobles. And so these guys came from quite a background. Life was changing for them, and it would have appeared that things were going to get very, very much better for them. But, verse 7, this is the commander of the officials. That is back a couple of verses earlier, Ashpenaz was referred to as the chief of the eunuchs. This is probably the same guy, Ashpenaz. The commander of the officials assigned new names to them. New names to them. So They get over to Babylon, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They all had names. They all grew up with these names. You know, it's interesting. Anybody know what the name Daniel means? The Hebrew word Daniel means? Yeah, the word Dan or Don means judge. And at the end, the EL, the literal translation of EL is strong one in Hebrew, but it refers to God. And so when you put Dan and El together, you have either God judges or God is judge. But in the word, you notice the little letter I in between the Dan and the L, that's called a Yod connective letter. Most of the time, that Hebrew Yod connective letter makes the word a first person possessive noun. And then it would be translated, God is my judge. Notice also that EL on the end of Daniel, which refers to God. Many Hebrew names in the Bible that we have read about have that EL on the end, and so the name has some reference to God. Ezekiel, besides Daniel, many others, they end in EL, so there's a name that refers to God. And then the next one, his name is Hananiah. And so you see the end of the Hebrew word IAH, Yah. Yah is it's a shortened form of Yahweh. So whenever you have a Hebrew word that ends in IAH, it also refers to God. The word Hananiah means Yahweh or Yah or Yahweh is gracious. And so think of the Hebrew names in the Old Testament that end in IAH. Who can think of one? What? I heard some. Jeremiah? Okay, who else? Nehemiah. Who else? Zechariah. Okay. Obadiah. Anybody in the 4 years of study we just did? Isaiah. Okay. So a lot of Hebrew names end in Yah, which is a reference to God, or end in El, which is also a reference to God. So Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. The next one, Mishael, ends in El. It means who is what God is. Who is what God is. And then finally, Azariah, also a reference to God. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. What do you notice about all four of those names that were given to these teenagers when they were born by their parents? Every one of them references God. Says something about today when people name their kids, some maybe name them or want to name their babies something that has a meaning behind the name. A lot of other times, a lot of people go buy a book of baby names, and you thumb through the book till you find one that sounds good. Or a lot of people will name their baby after a relative, a father, a mother, or a grandfather or grandmother. Interesting, what was common practice in Bible times, and this wasn't just true of the Jewish people, this was true of the pagans as well. They named their babies names that had some kind of a extreme significance to them. And so you have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all given names by their parents that referenced God. So they came from families that had a fear of and a knowledge of God, right? So then go back to verse 7 again. Daniel 1:7 says, then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. Why? You can't very well have Jewish guys, they go through this educational process, then they go through graduation, they're given positions to stand in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. These guys were in his court on a regular basis. You can't very well have them brandishing Jewish names that reference the God of Israel. They had to have names that referenced the pagan gods, and that's exactly what Ashkenaz did. So look, commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar. So Daniel means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means may Bel protect his life. Bel was the name of the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. So here's this guy whose name means Yahweh, the God of Israel is my judge, and he's given the name may Bel, the pagan chief of the Babylonian deity, and may he protect my life, his life. Next one says, Daniel assigned the name Belteshazzar to Hananiah, Shadrach. Hananiah, of course, Yahweh is gracious. Shadrach, the English, it ends at ACH. In the Aramaic language, it ends in what would sound like AK to us, and it is a reference to the name Aku, A-K-U. Aku was the Babylonian moon god. So Shadrach references Aku, and the name means the command of Aku. The command of Aku. So from Yahweh is gracious to the command of Aku. Next he says to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach. Notice the ACH on the end, also a reference to the moon god, Aku. And Meshach means, Mishael, the Hebrew word, his Hebrew name means who is what God is. Meshach means who is what Aku is. Goes from who is what God is to who is what Aku is. I think there's a little bit of a slap in the face for this young guy. So we're changing your name. It no longer means who is what God is. Now it means who is what Aku is. And then the last one, to Azariah, Abednego. Abednego. Azariah means Yahweh has helped. Abednego means the servants of Neb, which is the Babylonian god of wisdom. So every one of these guys had a name that referenced the God of Israel, and they were given names that referenced the pantheon of gods that the Babylonians worshipped. I wonder how they felt about that. I would imagine, somebody comes up to you and says, you know what, I'm not calling you by your name anymore. I'm calling you by this name, which happens to me sometimes, but it's usually in a derogatory sense. Imagine having your name changed, and you are given a name that not only disregards the God that you worshipped, but honors the false gods that the Babylonians worshipped. That must have been a tremendously upsetting experience. But they're given these new names. And then something interesting happens. Remember the diet? Every day we're eating filet mignon, lobster, what's that called? Thermidor? Anybody know what that is? Anybody ever eat that? That's like an expensive meal. I've seen it on menus. I never ordered it because I always thought it was like a week's worth of food for the price. They're given this great diet, which they might have been thinking at that time, you know what, it's bad, our names were changed, but guys, look at the menu. Well, that's not what Daniel was thinking. Daniel, there was a crisis here. Look at verse 8. Daniel says, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine that he drank. That phrase, made up his mind, literally means he set upon his heart or purposed in his heart. In other words, he basically was saying, there's no way I'm eating that food. And then also it says, made up his mind that he would not defile himself with that food. Not defile. The word defile means to pollute or stain or to soil. It's bad food. Wait a minute. How in the world could it be bad food? It's the food the king ate. It's the choicest food in the kingdom. It's the best cuts of meat. I mean, it's got to be perfect. How can he think it's bad food? Well, he assumed it was bad food because it was not kosher. And there could be we're not told exactly why, but there could be any number of reasons. It could, number one, this menu could have included foods that, according to the law, Leviticus chapter 11, that the Jews were forbidden to eat. Anybody know of an animal that produces food that the Jews were forbidden to eat? The pig, right? But lobster. Yeah, shelled fish, shelled seafood. Camels, horses. There could have been any number of foods in that diet that they would not have been allowed to eat. So Daniel says that would pollute me. I'm not going to do it. It also could have included foods that they were allowed to eat, but they weren't prepared properly in order to be kosher. The Jews were not allowed to eat anything that had fat in it, and they were not allowed to eat any meat that had blood left in it. And so, that steak that you see on the plate, when you say, I don't understand how people, I want it raw. I've heard people say, I want to see that thing moving when it comes in front of me. I want mine as dark and as done as it could be. But that blood that comes out. So they weren't allowed to eat food that had fat in it. They weren't allowed to eat food that had blood in it. And it's very very possible that would include some of this food. So it wouldn't have been kosher from that standpoint. Also, the meat, and this was true way back in Daniel's time, it was also true in the New Testament because Paul referred to this in his letters that the meat to the church at Corinth, the meat was often consecrated to the gods of the people that were eating the meat, worshipped. And that would have been an absolute no-no. And because the law forbid eating meat that was consecrated to false gods. And what about the wine? I mean, the Jews were allowed to drink wine. It was part of their national heritage. Every year at Passover, they had 4 cups of wine. So what about the wine? Well, the problem is in Babylon, the drinking wine was part of a ritual of the worship of idols. And so Daniel, thinking of all these things, said, I can't eat this stuff. Well, then, when that thought process took place, he made a request. Look at the middle of verse 8. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He approached Ashpenaz and he said, I got a request. I don't want to eat the food that you're putting before everybody, as good as it may taste and as expensive as it may be, as choice as it could be. Daniel says, we don't want to eat that. We need to be excused from eating that. Verse 9 says, Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Interesting that Daniel and his friends had not been in Babylon very long. But in that very short period of time, they had become a little bit close, at least, to Ashpenaz. Remember, he was the head of all of the eunuchs. And so he must have taken a shine to Daniel, at least Daniel, possibly his friends as well, for some reason. He saw something, maybe the way they deported themselves, the way they spoke, the way they interacted with people, something he saw in them that he liked, that he admired. And so he had compassion on them. Verse 9, favor and compassion in the sight of the commander. And then look at verse 10. It says, And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord, the king. Number one, Daniel, let me explain this to you. Nebuchadnezzar is not only powerful, he is fearful, fear-inducing. I'm afraid of him. And So he says, I'm afraid of my Lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. So Daniel, the king said, this is what you're going to eat, and this is what you're going to drink. And I'm a little bit afraid of going to him and tell him that, oh, these teenagers that you just brought in from Jerusalem, they don't want to eat this stuff, king. Imagine what how the king might have reacted. Well, you don't have to imagine. Look what he says. I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are of your own age? Because Daniel, this is what's going to happen. This food is the best food in the kingdom. It's healthy food. And if you eat this food, it's gonna fill you out and fill you up, make you gain weight. Maybe they were a little bit thin. Make you strong, make your complexion shine. It's going to do all of these things. But if you don't eat this food, and we get to the end of this, remember 3 years long, he says, we get to the end of this 3 years training process, and you're going to be standing there, you and your buddies are going to be standing there before the king. Everybody else looks good. They've gained weight. They're filled out. They look great. And here you 4 guys are going to be skinny and haggard looking. That's not going to be good, because Ashpenaz's idea is, because I'm the one that's responsible to make sure that you are looking. Remember, one of the requirements of these kids, they had to be handsome. And so Ashpenaz is concerned. He said, I'm afraid of the king. Why should he see you looking bad? And look at the end of verse 10. Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. So here's the picture. King Nebuchadnezzar sitting on his throne. This guy had an attitude. We'll see that later in the book of Daniel. He had an attitude. He wasn't pleasant to be around. He was, in fact, if you messed up even a little bit, that was dangerous for you. And so here's the king, Nebuchadnezzar, sitting on his throne, bring all these Jewish young guys in, and they all look, oh man, they're handsome, they're filled out, they look great, they look strong, they put on weight, build up muscle, complexions are clean, and these 4 guys, skinny and haggard, not looking so well, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, Ashpenaz, it was your job to make sure that they looked good at the end of 3 years, and Ashpenaz would have been, I'd like to say fired, but probably literally fired. He would have been killed, and he knew that. And so he says, Daniel, as much as I like you, as much as I'd love to help you, I can't do it. You'll be putting my life at risk, and I'm more important than you are to me, and so that's not going to happen. He refused the request of Daniel. But he wasn't as smart as Daniel. Daniel had another plan. He had plan B. You should always have a backup plan. He had plan B. Look what happened. Verse 11. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, the overseer, that is not Ashpenaz. That was a intermediary, a go-between, between Daniel and Ashpenaz. So you have this hierarchy. Here's the king up here, right? Here's Ashpenaz, the commander of all of his eunuchs under here. Here's Daniel down here, and in between Daniel and Ashpenaz is this overseer guy. And Daniel had this idea, okay, Ashpenaz said, no, we can't do that. You can't change my diet. Daniel says, I'm going to go to the overseer, the next guy under Ashpenaz. Now, you might say, well, that's stupid. That's not going to work. No, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Let's keep reading. Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, this is what Daniel said to this next guy up from him, below Ashpenaz. He said, verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Vegetables, zarora in Hebrew, which is the King James, I think the King James translates that as pulse, I believe, pulse. It referred to food that grows out of the ground, which would have included vegetables and grain. So basically what Daniel was saying, we don't want to eat meat and we don't want to have any dairy products, just what grows out of the ground. So vegetables and grain. So he says, for 10 days, he's not talking about 3 years, just give me a 10-day time, that's only a week and a half. For 10 days, let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink, that's all. Then, verse 13, then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So basically he's saying, give us 10 days on this diet, which doesn't include meat and dairy, and then when that 10 days is over, then I want you to look at the other youths and us, and then you make a decision based on what you see. And so verse 14 says, so he listened to them in this manner. Now, number one, 10 days is not that long in comparison to 3 years. So basically, he's probably figured, in 10 days, what's the worst that can happen? They might lose a little bit of weight. After all, they're not eating meat, no protein, right? So they might lose a little bit of weight, be a little bit skinny, but after 10 days, then I'll tell them, it doesn't work. You got to go back on, go on the king's diet. But he's probably also thinking, if this goes sideways, who's going to lose their head? Not me, Ashpenaz. And so the overseer is thinking, what do I have to lose? If they do good, then I get praised. If they do bad, Ashpenaz dies and I get a promotion. It was a win-win situation. So he agreed with it. Verse 14. So he listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. Now look at 15. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. Their appearance was amazing. And for those thinking, wow, this vegetarian diet thing maybe isn't so bad. This is not proof that a vegetarian diet is healthy. Number one, just about everybody that goes on a strictly vegetarian diet lose weight. They don't gain weight. These guys gained weight. And when they did, they not only gained weight, not only filled out, they looked better than the other youth. So, in other words, the diet they went on didn't make them as good as everybody else. It made them better than everybody else. How did that happen? It wasn't the food, I'll tell you that. You know what it was? It was God. God honored Daniel's commitment to obey the law as far as dietary requirements, and as a result of that, God blessed them. So not only did they pass the test, they passed the test with flying colors. Verse 16. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine that they drank, and kept giving them vegetables or pulse or grains and vegetables. 3 years of that same diet. And after 3 years of that same diet, all that became of them, their appearance, their strength, everything, was all as a result of trusting God and obeying God. Boy, there's probably a lesson in that for us today, don't you think? I obey God and follow God, and He's going to make sure that what I have, any issues in my life, He's going to take care of them so that His will's done, and I don't have to worry. I may not always win, but I don't have to worry. God's in control. He was certainly in control of them. Verse 17 says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them, not only did He make them look better, but it says God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. And then Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And that statement right there, Daniel understood all kinds of visions and dreams. It really sets the stage for the entire book. The visions and the dreams and Daniel's ability to interpret them will come up over and over. All because this young man decided, I'm going to serve God and obey God no matter what the cost. How could you do any better, right? Okay, I think we're about 2 minutes left. Questions, comments, ideas?
I got now the Magi.
Yes.
Could their interpretation of the star input these Jewish done?
Oh, yeah, absolutely it did. Absolutely it did. And that impact will be felt all the way forward to the time of the birth of Christ. Yeah, because that's where the Magi came from. Yep. Anybody else? Okay, let's close, and I think coffee's on downstairs. Father, thank you for our time together this morning. Thank you for the book of Daniel. Thank you for the tremendous testimony of this young man. I pray that our hearts would be encouraged and even challenged by it as we depart from the classroom and are prepared for our worship service. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. Have a great morning. See you in a little bit.